It was a typical Wednesday night, sometime between 1 and 2 a.m., and I found myself taking a solitary walk near a park patrolled by the police, not far from my apartment. The air was still, and the park, as it often was at this hour, lay completely deserted. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the faint breeze. I enjoyed these quiet moments, the time when the world seemed to pause, giving me space to reflect and unwind. I turned down a small, dimly lit street, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. My mind wandered as I walked, thoughts drifting aimlessly, eager to get back to the comfort of my home. The silence was almost comforting, a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of the day. But then I saw him. At the far end of the street there was a silhouette, a figure moving in an unusual manner. It was a man, dancing alone under the streetlights. His dance was strange, almost otherworldly, resembling a waltz, but with bizarre, jerky movements. It was as if he was performing a dance no one else could hear, a dance that seemed to defy logic and rhythm. Curiosity mixed with a tinge of unease as I continued my walk. I thought perhaps he was drunk, enjoying a moment of carefree abandon. As he danced closer, I moved to the edge of the sidewalk, giving him ample space to pass. The closer he got, the more I noticed the grace in his movements. He was tall and thin, dressed in an old, worn-out suit that fluttered with each step. My heart started to race as the man continued his strange dance-like approach. His presence, initially curious, began to feel unsettling. This was no ordinary encounter. As I watched, his form became clearer, and an inexplicable sense of dread began to creep over me. As the man drew nearer, my unease grew. His dance was becoming clearer, and I could see that it wasn't just a random drunken sway. There was a peculiar precision to it, an eerie elegance that made my skin crawl. He seemed to be in his own world, disconnected from reality, yet somehow drawing me into his strange, silent performance. I watched in morbid fascination as he twirled and stepped, his movements fluid, yet disjointed. The closer he came, the more details I could make out. He was incredibly tall and lanky, his limbs almost too long for his body. His suit, though old, was surprisingly well-fitted, adding to the surreal quality of his appearance. But it was his face that truly unnerved me. His eyes were wide open, almost unnaturally so, and they seemed to be fixed on something far above him. His head was tilted back, giving him a bizarrely elongated look, but what struck me most was his smile. It was wide, far too wide, stretching across his face in a grotesque, almost painful manner. It wasn't a smile of joy or friendliness. It was a rictus, a grin that spoke of madness. My pulse quickened, and a cold sweat began to form on my forehead. I decided to cross the street, hoping to avoid him entirely. My footsteps echoed in the quiet night as I hurried across the empty road, my eyes flicking back to him repeatedly. He continued to dance, oblivious or indifferent to my presence, but just as I reached the other side, I glanced back, and my heart nearly stopped. The man had ceased his dancing. He stood perfectly still, one foot in the street, parallel to me. He was staring directly at me, though his eyes still seemed fixed on some unseen point in the sky. The smile never left his face. It was as if he had frozen mid-movement, a puppet whose strings had been cut. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized he was now completely focused on me, his unnerving gaze and smile directed solely at me. Panic surged within me, but I forced myself to keep walking, my pace quickening with each step. I kept my eyes on him, terrified of what he might do next. He remained motionless, a nightmarish statue watching my every move. I turned my head for a moment to check the path ahead, ensuring I wouldn't trip or stumble. When I looked back, the man was gone from his previous spot. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the area frantically, my mind racing with fear and confusion. A sense of relief began to wash over me as I convinced myself that maybe he had just wandered off. But that fleeting moment of comfort was shattered when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. He hadn't left. Instead, he was now crouched down on the opposite sidewalk, partially hidden by the shadows. His body was twisted at an odd angle, yet his eyes, those unnervingly wide eyes, seemed locked onto me. My breath caught in my throat. How had he moved so quickly and so silently? It felt impossible. I hadn't taken my eyes off him for more than a few seconds, yet there he was, staring intently, a dark silhouette against the dimly lit street. His smile was still there, unchanged, as if it were carved into his face. Fear gripped me, colder and more intense than before. My instincts screamed at me to run, to put as much distance between us as possible, but my legs felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the surreal terror of the situation. The night, which had once seemed calm and quiet, now felt oppressive, filled with an ominous presence. The man slowly rose from his crouch, his movements deliberate and almost theatrical. He began to dance again, his steps exaggerated and grotesque. It was as if he were performing for an audience, but the audience was just me. He started to advance, his dance taking him closer with every step. Each movement was a mockery of grace, a disturbing parody of elegance. I forced myself to break free from my paralysis and began to back away, my eyes never leaving him. He continued his approach, the distance between us shrinking with alarming speed. His pace seemed to quicken, and his movements became more erratic, yet he never lost that unnerving, wide smile. As he closed in, my fear turned into sheer panic. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. The street around me seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against me. I glanced around desperately, looking for any sign of life, any potential escape. But the street was deserted, the windows of the surrounding buildings dark and uninviting. I turned and started to walk faster, almost breaking into a run, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing back. He was still there, his dance now more frantic and disjointed. He was gaining on me, his steps covering ground with unnatural speed. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my own pulse filling my ears. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear reached a breaking point and I bolted down the street, my footsteps echoing loudly in the still night. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself to move faster. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw that the man had stopped dancing. He stood still, one foot in the street, facing me. His head remained tilted back, eyes fixed on the sky, but his body was unnervingly aligned with mine, as if he could see me without truly looking. My mind raced with possibilities. Should I call the police? Should I knock on a door, hoping someone would answer at this hour? But before I could make a decision, the man began to move again. He didn't dance this time. He simply walked. His steps were slow and measured, yet each one seemed to cover an impossible amount of ground. He was closing the distance between us with terrifying efficiency. I forced myself to stay calm, to think logically. I needed to find a place to hide or a way to lose him. I turned down another street, then another, weaving through the neighborhood in a desperate attempt to shake him off. Each turn I made, I risked a quick glance back, hoping he'd given up the chase, but every time he was there, his tall, thin silhouette, a constant reminder of my peril. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I turned a corner and found myself in a small alleyway, poorly lit and filled with shadows. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to blend into the darkness, hoping he wouldn't see me. The seconds felt like hours as I listened intently, my ears straining to catch any sound of his approach. For a moment, there was nothing. The world was silent except for my own labored breathing and the distant hum of the city. I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had lost him. But then I heard it, the soft, deliberate tap of footsteps. He was close, too close. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible, praying he would pass by. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He was almost at the entrance of the alley. I pressed myself harder against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. And then he appeared. He stopped at the mouth of the alley, his head turning slowly, as if scanning the darkness. His smile was as wide as ever, his eyes still fixed skyward. For a terrifying moment, it felt like he was looking directly at me, despite his gaze being directed above. I could feel my heart in my throat, the fear threatening to overwhelm me. But just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and continued down the street, his steps once again slow and deliberate. I waited, frozen, until the sound of his footsteps faded into the distance. It was only then that I allowed myself to breathe, to release the tension that had held me captive. But the relief was short-lived. This wasn't over. I needed to get home to safety before he came back. I waited a few more moments, ensuring that the man was truly gone. The silence returned, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped cautiously out of the alley and back onto the street. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Who was this man, and what did he want? I began to walk quickly, my eyes darting in every direction, scanning for any sign of him. The night felt darker, more oppressive, as if the shadows themselves were conspiring to hide him from me. I turned down another street, hoping to put more distance between us. My footsteps echoed, the only sound in the eerie stillness, but my heart sank as I caught a glimpse of movement ahead. He was there, crouched again, halfway down the block, partially concealed by the darkness. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed locked onto me, even though his head remained tilted back. That smile, that terrible, unnatural smile, was still plastered across his face. My breath caught in my throat. How had he moved so quickly? It was as if he was toying with me, enjoying this twisted game of cat and mouse. I forced myself to keep moving, resisting the urge to run. Running would only provoke him, I told myself, though the fear gnawed at my resolve. Step by step, I edged closer to the opposite side of the street, keeping as much distance as I could between us. He didn't move. He simply crouched there, watching, waiting. My mind raced with desperate thoughts. Should I call someone? Should I scream for help? But the streets were deserted and I doubted anyone would hear me. Just as I was about to cross the street, he stood up. His movements were smooth, almost fluid, and he began to dance again, those exaggerated, grotesque steps bringing him closer. The way he moved was hypnotic, a macabre dance that seemed to defy all logic and reason. Each step he took covered an impossible amount of ground, closing the distance between us with alarming speed. Panic surged through me. I turned and started to walk faster, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back and my blood ran cold. He had stopped dancing and was now standing perfectly still, one foot on the curb, his head still tilted back, those wide eyes seemingly fixed on me. That smile, wide and terrible, seemed to grow even larger, stretching impossibly across his face. I quickened my pace, my mind a blur of fear and confusion. Why was he following me? What did he want? Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew I couldn't outpace him. I needed to find a way to lose him, to escape this nightmare. I turned down another street, hoping to find a place to hide, but the sense of dread only grew stronger. The night seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing down like a physical weight. I could feel his presence behind me, the eerie sensation of being watched, hunted. I glanced back once more, and my heart nearly stopped. He had moved again, faster than before, and was now standing at the end of the block, his eyes locked onto mine, that horrifying smile never wavering. I had to do something, and quickly. My mind raced, searching for any possible escape. I couldn't let him catch me. The fear was overwhelming, a suffocating force that threatened to consume me. But I couldn't give in. I had to keep moving, keep fighting. My life depended on it. I felt the adrenaline surge through my veins as I continued down the street, my eyes constantly flicking back to check on the man's position. Each glance over my shoulder filled me with more dread. He was still there, but now his movements had changed. No longer was he dancing or crouching. He was walking with long, exaggerated steps, each one covering an unnerving amount of distance. My breath came in shallow gasps as I turned another corner, desperately hoping to lose him. But he seemed to anticipate my every move, his tall, lanky figure appearing each time I glanced back. His persistence was terrifying, a relentless presence that seemed to defy reality. I couldn't understand how he moved so quickly, so silently. I felt the streets narrow around me as I turned into a more residential area, the darkened windows of the houses offering no comfort. The isolation was suffocating. I pushed myself to move faster, my footsteps echoing off the silent buildings, but no matter how fast I went, he was always there, just behind me, his wide eyes and grotesque smile unchanging. A sense of hopelessness began to creep in. How long could I keep this up? My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they would burst, but I couldn't stop. Stopping meant facing him, and I couldn't bear the thought. I had to find a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. Turning another corner, I spotted a small convenience store up ahead, its lights still on. Hope flared within me. Maybe I could find refuge there, maybe there would be people who could help. I sprinted towards the store, my last reserves of energy propelling me forward. The bell above the door chimed as I burst inside, the harsh fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the darkness outside. I stumbled to the counter, gasping for breath, trying to explain to the clerk what was happening. But as I looked back through the glass door, the street outside was empty. The man was gone. My words caught in my throat, confusion mixing with the lingering fear. Had he given up? Was he hiding somewhere, waiting for me to leave? The clerk looked at me with a mixture of concern and skepticism, clearly unsure what to make of my disheveled appearance and frantic demeanor. I tried to explain again, my voice shaking, but it felt futile. I wasn't even sure if what I had experienced was real. It felt like a twisted dream, a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. I spent a few more minutes in the store, catching my breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The clerk kept a wary eye on me, but there was nothing he could do. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I had to get home, to the safety of my apartment. I had to hope that whatever this was, it was over. Stepping back outside, the night seemed even darker, the silence even more oppressive. My senses were on high alert, every shadow, every movement making my heart race. But the street remained empty, devoid of the man who'd haunted me. I started walking again, cautiously, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. As I neared my apartment, the fear began to ebb slightly, replaced by exhaustion. I was almost home, almost safe. But just as I reached my building, I saw him again. He was standing across the street, perfectly still, his eyes wide, his smile impossibly large. He hadn't given up, he had just been waiting. My heart plummeted as I realized the nightmare was far from over. He began to move again, those long, exaggerated steps bringing him closer. Panic surged once more, but this time I knew I had to end it. I couldn't keep running. I had to face him, to find out what he wanted. Gathering the last of my courage, I turned to face the man, ready to confront the terror that had pursued me through the night. My legs trembled as I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. He was still moving toward me, those unnaturally long steps closing the distance with unnerving speed. His eyes, wide and fixed on the sky, seemed to glow in the dim light, and that terrible smile stretched across his face as if it were a permanent fixture. I stood my ground, trying to summon the courage to speak, to demand an explanation. But as he drew closer, words failed me. The fear was overwhelming, a suffocating force that choked any attempt at rational thought. All I could do was stare, frozen, as he came to a stop just a few feet away. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the night pressing in around us. His presence was oppressive, a dark, twisted energy that seemed to fill the air. I could feel his gaze, even though his eyes were pointed upwards, as if he could see me without truly looking. His smile, wide and fixed, made my skin crawl. Finally, I managed to find my voice, though it came out as a shaky whisper. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Why are you following me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, the smile never wavering. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were savoring the moment. I could see the slight twitch at the corners of his mouth, the only sign of any real emotion. It was a smile, but it was devoid of warmth or humanity. It was the smile of a predator. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to stay. I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to understand what was happening, to find some way to end this. "Please," I said, my voice stronger now. "Just tell me what you want." His head tilted further, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition? Amusement? It was impossible to tell. Then, slowly, he began to move again. This time he didn't dance. He walked, each step precise and controlled, as if he were closing in for the kill. My courage faltered, and I took another step back. He mirrored my movement, his smile growing even wider, if that were possible. The sense of dread was overwhelming, a dark cloud that seemed to envelop me. I realized, with a sinking heart, that there was no reasoning with him. Whatever he wanted, it wasn't something I could give or understand. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to think of what to do next. The street was empty, the buildings around me silent and dark. There was no one to help, no one to save me from this nightmare. I was alone, facing a terror that defied all logic and reason. He was almost upon me now, his eyes still fixed on the sky, his smile a grotesque parody of joy. I could feel the cold radiating from him, a chilling presence that seemed to seep into my bones. My mind raced, searching for any escape, any way to survive. Just as he reached out, his long fingers inches from my face, I acted on pure instinct. I ducked under his arm and sprinted down the street, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fear was too great. The need to escape, overpowering. I ran faster than I ever had in my life. the sound of my own breath loud in my ears. I could feel him behind me, that cold, dark presence chasing me through the night. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My apartment was just ahead, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I pressed my back against it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Silence enveloped me, the only sound the frantic beating of my heart. I was safe for now. But as I sank to the floor, exhaustion overtaking me, I knew this wasn't over. The smiling man was still out there, and he would come back. I sat there, my back against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The apartment was eerily silent, the only sound the rapid thumping of my heart. I tried to steady my breathing, my mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. The smiling man was out there, somewhere, lurking in the shadows. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every creak of the building making me jump. I strained to hear any sound from outside, but the world had gone deathly quiet. Slowly, I pushed myself up, my legs shaking, and made my way to the window. Peering through the curtains, I scanned the street below. It was empty, devoid of any sign of him, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, lingered. I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to come to me. I had to do something, anything, to feel a sense of control. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and dialed the police, trying to explain the bizarre encounter. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm, as she took my information and assured me that an officer would be dispatched to patrol the area. It offered little comfort, but it was something. Unable to sit still, I began to pace the apartment, my mind replaying every detail of the night. The way he moved, the eerie smile, his eyes fixed on the sky. None of it made sense, and yet it was all too real. I checked the locks on the doors and windows repeatedly, my anxiety driving me to ensure every possible entry was secured. Time crawled by and exhaustion began to overtake the adrenaline. I knew I needed rest, but the thought of closing my eyes, of letting my guard down, was terrifying. I settled on the couch, a blanket pulled tightly around me, and kept a wary eye on the door. Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by dreams of wide eyes and grotesque smiles. The first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, casting a faint glow across the room. The night had passed, but the fear hadn't. I felt a small sense of relief, but it was overshadowed by the lingering dread. I knew he was still out there, somewhere. The police arrived in the early morning, a knock on the door jolting me from my uneasy rest. I explained everything to the officer, my voice trembling as I recounted the night's events. He listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. It sounded unbelievable, even to me, but I knew what I had seen. The officer promised to increase patrols in the area and left me with a number to call if I saw anything suspicious. Left alone again, the apartment felt both like a sanctuary and a prison. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being pursued. I spent the day in a haze, checking the windows constantly, jumping at every sound. Friends and family called, their voices a lifeline to normalcy. But I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. How could I explain something so surreal?